Hi again. We are back for part 2 of our multi-part series on how to seam together a sweater, in this case a set-in sleeve sweater. We've already done the shoulders using a stitch-to-stitch mattress seam, so that's a V to an A is what I usually refer to those stitches as. Our next step when we're seaming is actually going to be setting in the sleeve. I know many people tend to seam up the side and the sleeve and then set that sleeve in, but it is such a treacherous job. It's really no fun to try to set a whole cap into an open space. It's really not fun. So my trick for that is I'm going to lay out my sweater this way. So I've got my entire armhole open here. Hope we can get that all in the camera. Got the entire armhole here, and then I'm going to set in the sleeve like so. I'm going to set it in like this. One whole piece, put all in there. It makes it so much easier if you can work your sweater flat when you're seaming. Another cool trick I do when I am setting in a sleeve, and again, as I mentioned in the previous video, I am using for this section a skinny yarn. I'm not using the same yarn. You'll notice I have a similarly colored fingering weight that I'll be using to seam the sweater together, even though the yarn I used in the sweater was a chunky weight. I just don't want big bulky seams. All right, so what I'm going to do is take enough of this yarn that I can span from one end of the sweater all the way to the other twice. So I'm starting my hand over here, grabbing 1 and 2 lengths of yarn. So for an adult sweater, typically I'll just span across both my arms twice, and that's how much yarn I need. All right, so I'm going to thread my finishing yarn onto my tapestry needle, and this is one of my very cool tricks, if I do say so myself. What I like to do is start at the very center of the sleeve cap, seam from there to there. Then I turn the sweater around and I seam this side of the sleeve cap. The reason I like to do that rather than starting here and working all the way across is that sometimes when you do that, it shifts the sleeve over, so your sleeve won't be centered, or you end up having to set in the extra fabric right at the top of the shoulder, which looks awkward. This makes it much more even looking because you're starting both sides of the cap at the same place and working down. All right, so, and I'll demonstrate that, of course, in just a moment. Before I do, I'd like to talk about how the caps look. So what we've got here are bound off stitches and little stair steps of bound off stitches. So those should be familiar from seaming the shoulder together. Those we're going to be picking up either A's or V's depending on which direction the sleeve is in. If it's at the bottom, we're picking up an A, and if it's turned around on top, it'll look like a V. So those are A's and V's. Then right here in my sleeve cap, I have a plateau, if you will. If this is the mountain of the sleeve cap, here's a straight cliff. And right here, these are actually rows. So I'll be taking A's and V's, stitches right here, but then right over here, the fabric shifts into rows. And then, so I'm going to come down these rows, and then right back here, I'm back to stitches, A's and V's. So sleeve caps can be a little, they seem tricky to people because you're not getting that sense of, oh, well, what stitch am I actually looking at? If you can break it down into either a stitch or a row or a stitch, seaming becomes so much easier. So right here on the body of the sweater in my armhole, I have a straight line. So I have all these rows, which are just going to be these little bars here. And then right down here, I have V's, stitches. Where I have any bound off edge or cast on edge, that is a stitch. And anything that's on the side or worked with decreases are rows. Okay, so let's start. What I'm going to do is fold my sleeve in half and find the very center or close to it, A in this case, because my stitch is pointing up. And I'm going to take my yarn and I'm going to leave half of it out. So I have half of my yarn that I'm not seaming with right here. Okay, the other half of my yarn I'm going to begin seaming with. So yeah, it's roughly half. You can measure it out if you want to be particular. All right, so what I'm going to do is at the seam, I've grabbed already one stitch right here, an A, and now here at the seam, I'm going to grab the very first bar, so the very first row. Then down here, I'm grabbing another A. Here, I'm going to grab another row. So I'm going into the same hole my yarn comes out of, and I'm grabbing the next row. Here I'm grabbing the next stitch. So we're never skipping anything. I'm never scooting ahead like this and ignoring these rows. I'm always going into the same hole that the yarn comes out of so that I can guarantee I'm not skipping anything. Now, there is a discrepancy between stitches and rows in terms of gauge. Our rows are smaller, shorter than stitches. So every so often you have to take 2 bars, 2 rows to 1 stitch. And depending on your gauge and on your pattern and the height of the sleeve cap, that may vary. So you tend to have to play with it, but my general rule is single, single, double, single, single, double. I usually start there. Okay, here is where it gets interesting. I have a bit of a stair step, right? I've got a stitch that if I were to grab the A right here, first of all, that side is kind of funky looking, and my needle is hanging off then in the middle of nowhere. Because I've got this stair step, I'm actually going to walk downstairs. I'm going to pick up the first half of my stitch, walk downstairs, and grab the second half. So I'm going at an angle at those stair steps. I'm grabbing a single bar here. Here I have a regular A. Here it's time for a double. Now here I am again at a stair step. If I were to grab that full stitch, my needle's out in the middle of nowhere. So I'm going to go in and come up on the other side. You'll notice this is one full column here. I'm just putting my needle in on the stair step at one side of the column and the lower stair on the other side of the column. All right, so that's how you deal with those steps. All right, so let's see, 2, 1, here's another single. Also coming up with some sort of pattern, like 2, 1, or single, single, double, single, single, double, helps you make sure that all your other pieces come out the same way. And I went a little too far without pulling. Usually I recommend that we pull a little more frequently than what I did. I did about 2 inches. And here you can tell when you've done a nice mattress stitch seam because actually the yarn can just pull right out. It's nice and smooth and even, nothing has snagged. All right, so I'm still going. Every so often I'm gonna check in on my piece and make sure that everything looks like it's going to fit. All right, so here's my double. I may not have been up to a double yet, but that's okay. I'm gonna speed things up. And here we are now. I am at my ledge, so to speak, of the mountaintop. So I'm going to just grab this half stitch here. Instead of grabbing the full one, I'm going to grab a half stitch, a single, and now I've turned this piece and I'm going to start grabbing these bars along the side. And again, I'm going to check in and see. It looks like I might have an even number of bars or maybe a couple extra on this side. So let's see, I'm going to take a single here, and because I worry that this side has a few extra, I'm going to take a double bar right there, 2 bars, so 2 rows. Then single, 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 another single, and I'm going to pull tight and just see where I'm at. So far so good, looks nice there. Our goal is to match up these bind offs right here. Typically your set-in sleeve patterns will have similar bind off counts for both the cap sleeve and the armhole. If it doesn't, you'll have to fudge a bit, but usually they should have the same number. So I bound off 4, I bound off 4, I bound off 2, I bound off 2. So those are going to match up. I want those to meet. Otherwise, this looks great. If you want to, you can even count your rows to make sure that this is equal now at this point. Let's see. All right, so now here it gets a little interesting because earlier we had gone off the edge of the mountain, like off the edge of the cliff. Here now we're coming down the cliff and the mountain starts again, a new plateau begins. So I'm going to grab this last bar and the first half, or the second side of this A. So I'm bridging the gap in this way. right, and then once you've gotten that, now we switch to A to V. So stitch to stitch, the same type of seam that we had for the shoulder, where stitches or a bound off edge meets stitches or another bound off edge. And we are also working in some stair steps here, but you're old pros at that now. Here we go. And again, pull every inch or two just to make sure everything is lining up. Looking good. All right, awesome. So I'm just going here until I've picked up the last of each stitch on each side, like that, pulling tight and leaving the yarn. You're gonna see why we leave it later. I'm gonna pull that a little tighter to just give myself a little extra yarn over there. And now I have this yarn here at the top of my sleeve cap. I'm going to flip around the sweater, grab this yarn, put it on my tapestry needle, and now set in this half of the sleeve cap. So I'm going to begin right here at the seam. My yarn is coming out on the sleeve cap part, so I'll start over here on the armhole. I'm going to grab the first bar, the first row, and now since my stitches are upside down or looking down towards the seam, I'm picking up a V. So that's the stitch that's pointing down. All right. And here we go. I'm going to follow that single, single, double, single, single, double row pattern at the bottom, always to a V on the top until I get to until I get to my plateau. So here I have another V and 2 bars. And you should uncurl this edge with your hand so that you can really see, and don't be afraid to stretch out your fabric a little to get a sense of where your bars are. Here I'm at another one of those stair steps. This time I'm walking downstairs. It's more like I'm going upstairs, I guess. So you're going to come in where the yarn comes out. So I just finished picking up this stitch. I'm going in here, and my needle goes at an angle, bridging from the top of this step to the top of that one. Here's another one. So you come in and come up. So it looks like I'm all over the place, but really I'm in this single column where I've come in down here on row 1 and exited on that same column, that same stitch, but on row 3. That is the trick there. Let's see, I have a single. I'm gonna just give it a pull because I'm running low on yarn. Here we go. And again, pull a little more frequently than I do, especially if you're just starting out with Mattress Stitch, because if you end up accidentally making a knot, if you've gone 3 inches past it, it's so disheartening to have to like rip back out to that knot. So better while you're starting and getting a hang of it to just pull more frequently. So every inch or so. All right, so here we go. My yarn just came out here. I'm going to grab this single half stitch right here because I'm about to go down that mountain, about to go down that cliff rather. I'm going to take a single bar here, just while I get started, a single bar here. So now I'm doing rows to rows, bars to bars on each side. I'm going to take a single there and a single here, and if memory serves me correctly from the other half, I had an extra row right in this section, so I'm going to take 2 bars to account for the extra row to the single over here. Then I'm going to go back to single, 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 single. And let's pull tight and see where it's matching up. You'll notice I did not use pins here. I find them to be a hindrance. Additionally, like, you could pin this in the totally wrong spot of where it's not even going to lay flat. So they kind of sometimes, in addition to getting in the way, also misrepresent where you need to actually be seaming and which parts need to match up to what. Here I visualize it that these are going to match up. If you want to, you could pin that together there so you have your goal, but again, then it tightens up this area and makes it a little harder to seam. So there are benefits to both. All right, so here I'm at my last row, heading into my first stitch of that little underarm bind off area. Last row into the first stitch, single. Now we're taking V's to A's because we have a bound off edge here. Stitches to stitches rather than rows to rows or stitches to rows. And you'll notice when I'm doing stitches to stitches, it's a 1-to-1 ratio. Here, when I did rows to rows, when I was picking up bars, it was single to single, or 2-to-2 you can take. I'll show you that on the sleeves and side seams. And then when I was doing stitches to rows up here, it was about 3 stitches for every 4 rows. So I took always 1 stitch, but single, single, double, single, single, double, and that ratio helps make a nice flat seam without puckering or stretching. All right, awesome. So then once you've finished that seam, what I like to do is give the edges just a little stretch to let it be a little more smooth. And here we go. We'll look at that nice set-in sleeve. Gorgeous. Oh, I love it. It's so satisfying. But this is our set-in sleeve. I'm going to repeat that on the other side. I'll just show you again how I start that, but then I'll set in the other sleeve off camera. See you for the, oh, here we go. Sorry. Before I say see you for the next step, let me do what I said. There we go. Other sleeve right here. So I'm taking the span of my sweater from one end to the other twice with this tapestry yarn. Happens to be just washable baby wool, but we'll call it tapestry yarn. Threading it on my needle, finding the center stitch at the top of the sleeve cap, and it's an A because it's on the bottom, and I'm bringing my yarn through, leaving half of my yarn out to the right, and the other half of that length is on my knitting needle, or tapestry needle, excuse me. So I'm gonna scoop down here, grab a bar right at the seam, and then repeat that process for setting in this sleeve cap that I did for the other one. All right, I'll see you for side and sleeve seams in our next installment of the finishing video. Thanks for watching.